Well, thank you, President Yu. And I'm going to proceed in the tradition of these Haskins lectures and present a history of some 80-odd years of learning, summing up what I've learned along the way, and weighing the profits from spending your life in this kind of human activity. But I'm not going to be talking very much about myself. Instead, I'm going to introduce you to 6 people I've met in the course of this work, getting to know them in their own words, and then trying to sum up what I've learned from them. They're all great speakers of the English language, gifted with an uncommon eloquence, people larger than life. And I think you'll remember them as vividly as anything I have to say about them. First, a little something about my upbringing and the people I knew early in life. As Pauline Yu just said, I was born in Rutherford, New Jersey in 1927, far enough from New York City so that I can always view that great metropolis from a distance. My high school years were spent in Fort Lee. It's a town with a high proportion of working-class German and Italian Americans, just across the Hudson River from New York. They were the people I knew best, some the closest of friends, others in frequent conflict, but when we met in later years, we recognized a common ground. Well, I left that community behind when I attended Harvard from 44 to 48. My degree was in English and philosophy, but I studied enough chemistry to serve me well when I began work in the laboratory of a family business. For the next 11 years, I made printing inks and silkscreen inks in intimate association with the men of the factory. As much as I enjoyed this life, there were limitations to it. No matter how clever your formulation, no matter how deep your insights into the workings of your complex product, you couldn't publish your ideas. These were trade secrets. In '61, I returned to academic life then and took up the study of linguistics at Columbia. This was an attractive world of intense debate on the structure of language and its history of constant change. However, I discovered that most of the activity was remote from the procedures that I was used to. Most of the linguists I met were gathering data by introspection, asking themselves, can I say this? Can I say that? It occurred to me that I might start a new way of doing linguistics by building the study of language and what people actually did say in everyday life. In this enterprise, I found that my years as an industrial chemist weren't wasted. I drew from them 3 assets. One was a firm conviction that the real world would prove you right or wrong when the products of your work were put to the test, perhaps by harsh weather or maybe high-speed printing presses or whatever. Second was that this result depended on a certain precision of method. You'd never know if you were right or wrong unless you had carefully entered into your notebook each step you'd taken. The third asset was a lasting acquaintance with working-class styles of speech, ways of arguing, joking, telling stories, and passing the time during the noon-hour break. These are the elements that I put to work in a field that came to be called social linguistics, or maybe the study of linguistic change and variation. My first chance to test this approach was on a visit to a friend on the island of Martha's Vineyard, where I noticed a particular way of speaking that had not been reported before. People saying, right about now, instead of right about now. It was particularly interesting because the Linguistic Atlas of New England, a generation before, had reported vineyarders as saying out, not out. And this sound change was actually reversing the direction of history. I began to trace this sound change by recording people all over the island, and the first interview I did reflected the traditional methods of dialect geography, full of questions about New England regional words and expressions. One of the first people I talked to was Donald Poole, an 8th-generation descendant of Yankee whalers and fishermen. He was one of the key figures in the little fishing town of Menamsha. I was told that long-term summer people counted themselves as having arrived if Donald Poole said hello to them on the dock. And Donald Poole was a great speaker. You couldn't talk to him for 5 minutes without being drawn into the major issues of living and earning a living. As I listened to him, I became more and more immersed in what he was saying as well as how he was saying it. You can hear him yourself. The tape recorder was not the best, and you'll have to bear with the background noise from the spring peepers that were very loud at that time of the year.
You see, you people who come down here, Martha's Vineyard, don't understand the background of the old families on the island. Strictly a maritime background and tradition. our interests run that way, our thoughts still run that way. I'm speaking now of the descendants of the old families. And what we're interested in, the rest of America, this part over here across the water that belongs to you and we don't have anything to do with, has forgotten all about the maritime tradition and the fact that if it hadn't been for the interest that the early settlers in this country took in the ocean, both as whalemen, as fishermen, and as seamen and merchant sailors, this country couldn't have existed. The Plymouth colony would have been a failure.
Well, it became clear that Poole was a prime exponent of the Protestant ethic, with a strong emphasis on the importance of work as a calling. So I asked him, what reason do people have to work harder than they have to earn a living?
What reason do people have to work harder than they have to earn a living?
I can answer that for you, because I've already worked that up for myself and argued it before with many men. It's the satisfaction of feeling that you have accomplished something over and above the bare necessities of life. You take a pride in doing the best that you can according to your ability. I don't have to go fishing. I can quit right now and be comfortable. But just as long as I draw the breath of life, I'll be down in my boat in the morning at 6 or 6:30 in the morning, bound somewhere, doing all that I can, as best as I can, to the best of my ability and knowledge. Because I take a pride in doing that, something I know, and I feel that I'm doing something important. And I'm happier doing that than I would be sitting around the beach. A man with New England conscience can't sit still. Does that answer your question?
The particular sound change that I was focusing on is exemplified in Donald Poole's "I take a pride in doing that." That is, pride in place of pride. We refer to it as centralization because at the beginning of the diphthong I, the tongue moves closer to the center of the mouth. To track this variation across many social dimensions, I created a 4-point scale of centralization: right, 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 right. Now, no, no, no. Using both acoustic and auditory measurement, I was able to establish a mean centralization value of the vowels for I and ow for each individual. So the progress of the sound change on the island seemed variable in the extreme, correlated not only with age, but also by gender, occupation, neighborhood, and ethnicity. My interviewing methods had accordingly shifted to a broader range of social issues. In my interviews with fishermen, farmers, local businessmen, across 3 generations, with Yankees, Gayhead Indians, and Portuguese, I found a connection between the sound change and the major concerns that troubled people in everyday life. I found the local people were under great pressure from the wealthy summer people from the mainland, who were buying up as much of the shoreline property as they could. Some younger people left the island to earn a living on the mainland, but others stayed and resisted this outside pressure. Centralization was strongest among them. Donald Poole was archetypical for his generation. His son Everett Poole was even more so. He'd returned from college to set up a business selling fish on the Menemsha docks, and his centralization values were the most extreme. Where his father said, "I take a pride in doing that," his son would say, "He tried and tried until he was tired out entirely." Reviewing the interviews as a whole, some expressed positive orientation towards remaining on and working on the island. Others were neutral, and a small number were negative, indicating a strong motivation to leave the island. The clearest correlation found between centralization and social factors is shown as Table 1, which associates centralization with orientation towards the island. So 40 people with positive orientation had values of 63 and 62, 19 were neutral, values of 32 and 42, and the 6 negative people were down at 09 and 08. The centralization thus emerged as a symbol of social identity, driven by an unconscious mechanism of incrementation as the struggle to maintain local rights and privileges intensifies across generations. The finding has been generally accepted, frequently cited, and taken as paradigmatic for the social motivation of sound change. Studies of many other small communities under outside pressure have found a similar resurgence of linguistic markers of social identity. Two linguists have revisited Martha's Vineyard to see what has happened in recent years. One found the phenomenon was no longer present, but the other found that it was, that it continued vigorously for some time, but showed signs of recession among the youngest speakers. Martha's Vineyard study was my master's essay. My dissertation was an attack on a larger problem, the widespread variability in the speech of New York City, which had frequently been described as chaotic, unpredictable. The problem of method became central here. New Yorkers are very self-conscious and negative in regard to their own local dialect. When any attention was paid to language, they tended to correct their pronunciation in an irregular fashion towards a form of speech that's as different from New York as possible. I had to overcome this tendency if I wanted to record the vernacular, which was my target. That is the first learned form of language that's used with friends and family when no outside observer is present. For that reason, my interview developed techniques for eliciting narratives of personal experience, where speakers were so deeply involved in what they were saying that they paid little attention to speech. I used this instrument in a survey of the Lower East Side of New York City, building on a random sample constructed for a social science project. In the summer of '63, I called on the brownstone house of Jacob Schissel, 63 years old, who had recently retired from the Postal Service. At one point in the interview, I asked Schissel if he had ever been in a situation where he thought he was going to be killed. He said, "Yes. My brother put a knife in my head." I said, "What happened?" He said that
a few days after my father had died, and we were sitting shivering. The reason the fight started, he saw a rat out in the yard. This was out in Coney Island, and he started talking about it. My mother had just sat down to have a cup of coffee, and I told him to cut it out. Of course, kids, you don't have to listen to me. So that's when I grabbed him by the arm and twisted it up behind him. When I let go of his arm, there was a knife on the table. He just picked it up and he let me have it. And I started bleeding like a pig. And actually, first thing you do, run to the doctor. And the doctor just says, "It's about this much more." He says, "You'd have been dead."
I've been living with this narrative for 45 years. Whether I tell it or play the tape, it has an extraordinary force that commands the attention of an audience, large or small. I'm trying to understand how this and other narratives told in our interviews can transfer the experience of the speaker to the listener in such a compelling way. I've been drawn into the study of narrative itself. In Schissel's story, there are cultural details specific to the Jewish community. The family sitting Shiva, that is 7 days for the dead, and the preference for silence. But the issue of life and death and how we deal with them are universal. In '67, I wrote a paper with Joshua Wiletsky on narrative analysis. It provided a structural framework that's today widely used in the field of narrative studies. It's actually cited in more than half of the papers published in the journal Narrative Inquiry. Several of my later papers on narrative wrestle with the central question of this and many other narratives. What brings about the sudden escalation of violence when words give way to action? I'll be pursuing that issue further in my next project, which is a book on oral narratives of personal experience under the title, The Language of Life and Death. What are the linguistic implications of Jacob Schissel's interview? You may have noted that as a speaker of the New York City vernacular, he used a traditional oralist pronunciation, such as he started to talk about it.
He started talking about it.
Or
that's when I grabbed him by the arm and twisted it up behind him. When I let go of his arm.
So we hear the pronunciation of the oralist form arm as opposed to arm. Now, Figure 1 shows the percent of consonantal R used by Jacob Schissel in 5 styles in the course of the interview. Casual speech as in his narratives, careful speech in the main body of the interview, and with increasing focus on R, a reading passage with many R's in it, lists of isolated words, and finally the person is asked to read pairs like God and God, dock and dock, and say for each pair whether they're the same or different. As an older traditional user of the New York City pattern, Schissel's use of consonantal R was close to zero until we reached word lists where he pronounced R 30% of the time, and minimal pairs 75% of the time. Now in itself, this doesn't tell us more than that Jacob Schisel thought he should pronounce R as a consonant. But when we superimpose this pattern on the Lower East Side as a whole, as in Figure 2, we see that it's part of the system that unites the city as a whole. Figure 3, the combined social and stylistic stratification of the city is shown here. For each style, we can see social differentiation of the use of consonantal R. The higher the social class, the more the R. At the same time, New Yorkers agree in their evaluation of R. All social class groups increase consonantal R with increasing attention paid to speech. The middle class, the upper working class, the lower working class. This display of independent effects of style and social class changed the view of the urban speech community from chaotic unpredictability to orderly heterogeneity, and created a new paradigm for social linguistic inquiry. We see in the constant slope of style shifting a community united by consensus, yet in each context differentiated by social class. Similar patterns have since been found in many other cities and many other languages. The study of such social linguistic variables has since yielded rich information on how sharply stratified a community is, the degree of social mobility, and how linguistic change moves through the social system. The random survey of the Lower East Side included a good percentage of African Americans. Through a number of incidental and accidental observations, I became convinced that the techniques for approaching the vernacular of white speakers didn't work well for African Americans. The speech I was recording from them reflected more their accommodation to me than the speech pattern they used when they were talking to each other. At the same time, I became aware that a study of the African American vernacular might be helpful in attacking one of the major problems of our society, the minority gap in academic achievement. So I obtained funds from the Office of Education to approach this problem in a systematic way. We set up a team project in South Harlem of African American field workers and linguists, and we rented a clubhouse on 112th Street, and there interviewed members of all the named groups of African American youth in a 4-block area: the pre-adolescent Thunderbirds and Aces, the adolescent Jets and Cobras, the young adult Oscar Brothers. In many interviews at the clubhouse and group sessions in a basement of Columbia building, we came close to solving the observer's paradox, that is, to observe how people behave when they're not being observed. Now, one of the core members of the Jets was Larry Hawthorne. He was then 16 years old, one of the 6 best fighters of the group, a gifted storyteller, and a speaker of uncommon eloquence. I'd like to play an excerpt from an interview conducted by our best field worker, KC, who appeared to the Jets as an older version of themselves, so the initials KC referred to his boxing name, Kid Chocolate. Many of the youth had become involved in the Nation of Islam, and KC was engaging Larry in a Socratic dialogue on matters of belief.
What happened to you after you died, do you know?
Yeah, I know.
What?
After they put you in the ground, your body turns into bones and shit.
What happens to your spirit and shit?
Your spirit, as soon as you die, your spirit leaves you.
And, where does the spirit go?
Well, it all depends.
Oh, wow.
You know, like some people say, if you're good and shit, your spirit going to heaven. You're good. If you're bad, your spirit going to hell. But bullshit, your spirit going to hell anyway, good or bad. You know? Why? Why? I'll tell you why. Because you see, doesn't nobody really know that it's a God, you know? Because I mean, I have seen black gods, pink gods, white gods, all color gods. And don't nobody know it's really a God. And when they be saying if you good, you going to heaven, that's bullshit. Because you ain't going to no heaven. Because it ain't no heaven for you to go to.
Well, if there's no heaven, how could there be a hell?
I mean, yeah. Well, let me tell you, it ain't no hell because this is hell right here, you know? Yeah, this is hell right here.
As you'll observe, the game being played here is governed at each turn by the rules of logic. Larry's logic and his observation of the world around him leads him to the same conclusion that Christopher Marlowe puts in the mouth of Mephistopheles in his version of Faust, "Why, this is hell, nor am I out of it." But Casey pursues the matter further, pressing Larry on one of his favorite questions, is God black or white?
But you don't really know if it's a God or not. Nobody really knows that. Nobody.
That's true. That's true. But just saying that there is a God, what color is it? White or black?
He'd be white, man.
Why?
Why? I'll tell you why. Because the average whitey out here got everything. You dig? And a nigga ain't got shit, you know? You understand? So, for that to happen, you know it ain't no black God that's doing that bullshit.
Yeah, I gotta go for that, boy.
Nigga, that's square business, man.
I quoted this passage in an article called The Logic of Non-Standard English. The paper was a response to the common view of educational psychologists that African American youth have no true language of their own. What they speak is a series of emotional cries, giant words with no logical structure. They must learn to speak standard English before they can learn anything else. The article has been reprinted hundreds of times, more than anything else I've written, and the quotation from Larry has been cited many more times than that. The argument that I put forward, that African American vernacular English is a well-formed dialect with all of the structure necessary for logical thought, was obvious to linguists, but not to teachers and educators. The view that it argued against, that this form of speech is nothing but a collection of bad words and mistakes, and the poor black children are mentally handicapped by it, is not dead. Indeed, a rather proper English educator, John Honey, based a whole book on the theme that Larry wasn't logical after all. Now, our studies of Larry's dialect had a considerable effect on the field of linguistics. For the first time, we studied the internal linguistic factors that control variation, that is, the phonological and grammatical environment. I can best illustrate this by referring to the one variable that took the most attention, the variation in the realization of the verb and auxiliary is. Now, every speaker of the dialect uses three forms, three variants. Don't nobody know if it is a God, the full form, the contracted form, it ain't no black God that's doing that bullshit, and the zero form, if you be bad, your spirit going to hell. Now, other dialects show only two, the full and contracted form, but not zero. Some early observers of this dialect, familiar with Caribbean Creole languages, argued that the zero form was the true variable, the true dialect. The others were just importations from standard English. But we concluded from the systematic way in which the forms of is varied, according to the preceding and following elements, that the copula had a firm foundation as the full form in the underlying grammar. The contraction removed the vowel if it was unstressed, and the zero form was a further extension of contraction. These patterns were replicated in many other studies, showing something even more astonishing, that African American vernacular English has the same uniform grammar across the entire United States. So figure 4, put together by John Rickford, superimposes the results of 8 studies of the effect of the following grammatical element on the deletion. The vertical axis is the percent of the zero form of is. The horizontal axis shows the following grammatical form. A noun phrase, as in he my brother, with the lowest percentage. Then adjectives, as in he crazy, and locatives, as in he outside. Progressive verbs, as in he talking a lot. And finally, the future form, he gonna do it. The red and orange lines show our Harlem studies, the Thunderbirds, the Jets, and the Cobras. The green line is Walt Wolfram's 1967 study of adolescent speakers in Detroit. The purple line is a speaker from the Bay Area. The orange line is from John Ball's research in Pacoima, a black suburb of Los Angeles. And the yellow and brown lines are results from Bailey and Sucre Avala's long-term study of a small town in Texas. The basic pattern is replicated throughout the United States, along with all other grammatical features of this dialect. An explanation of the pattern you see here, and this national uniformity, is still high on the agenda for the many students of change and variation who are concerned with the speech of African Americans. My major interest in the study of language has always been on the causes of linguistic change, particularly change from within the system, not borrowed from some outside center of prestige. In New York City, a third of the vowels are engaged in such internal change. In 1970, I moved to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia here, where 2/3 of the vowels were changing. While the causes of such instability remain mysterious, we made some progress by changing the question from why does language change to who is changing the language. An hypothesis emerged from the New York City study and 2 others that followed the same methods. Peter Trudgill's work in Norwich, England, and Henrietta Cedegrun's study of Panama City, Panama. The curvilinear hypothesis argued that internal linguistic change was not initiated in the highest or lowest social classes, as had previously been thought, but began in the centrally located upper working and lower middle classes. I therefore engaged in a search for the leaders of linguistic change in Philadelphia throughout the 1970s with long-term studies of 10 neighborhoods stratified by social class. One of the upper working class neighborhoods was in South Philadelphia. Here's a view of our fair city, and with South Philadelphia right there, just about there. Now, in one South Philadelphia neighborhood, we met Celeste Sullivan. She was a central figure on our block and introduced us to many other people. As you'll hear, she was a strong exponent of Philadelphia vowel shifts. But the effect of this strong local accent will be submerged in the impression of a powerful personality, an arranger and controller of the world of social relations. I'll introduce her to you by playing one of 6 narratives from Chapter 12 of my second volume on Principles of Linguistic Change, a chapter devoted to the description of the leaders of linguistic change in Philadelphia. Here she is being interviewed by our gifted field worker, Ann Bauer. The story involves USO canteens for servicemen set up during World War II.
My mother I used to go to the movies, and she used to send a couple of boys up the street to watch who I used to be in the movies with.
Did she really?
Oh, yeah. But we were in cahoots, the boys and I. Yeah. That's the only way you could get out of it. Or like I would date, and like my father would say, "Where are you going?" "Well, Daddy, now look, Georgie's going to take me, Georgie, down the street." See, and Daddy thought, "Oh boy, she's safe with George."
Sure.
So Georgie would go his way, and I would go my way.
You have brothers.
And then we would meet. See, at a certain time, I said, "Georgie, please, Georgie, don't do that to me. You better be there." He'd say, "Don't worry," because his father was just as bad as my father. We would meet, and we'd come home like 2 nice little kids. But I used to go dance at the canteen.
The canteen?
Yeah, they had a canteen that was all servicemen. And you couldn't get in if you didn't have a date. And you'd have to be a serviceman to take you in. But once you got in, you could leave this guy, and dance with everybody else. And that's what we used to do, stand in the corner and wait for the fellas, and I'd say to one of the sailors, "Are you going in there?" And he'd say, "Yeah." "Would you take me in?" "Sure." And they would take it, and nothing bad would happen. And the Salvation Army ran a beautiful thing. It was only coffee and donuts. There was no drinking and soda and music. All night you dance, dance, dance.
Well, you heard the extreme raising of short A in bed and dance. You also heard a raising of the vowel of down, as in down the street. The curvilinear pattern, confirming our hypothesis, emerged, as shown in this figure. Here the vertical axis is a measure of the fronting of ow in south, and down. The horizontal axis shows 6 social groups. You can see the most extreme forms are in the middle and upper working class. Here is Celeste's utterance, down the street.
Down the street, down the street.
The measured value is 2578 hertz, considerably higher than the mean for her social group. Now this is a scattergram, shows the mean values for this measure of ow for 112 speakers from the Philadelphia neighborhood study. The horizontal axis is age. The vertical axis is the acoustic measure of this shift of the ow vowel in down, south, the same as in figure 4. Those at the bottom of the scale, at 1500, are saying out, down. Those at the top of the scale say out, down. The lines are partial regression lines showing the trend for each class. The dark blue line is that of the upper working class ahead of the others with a steeper slope. Celeste is circled here at 47 years of age in 1973 and 2463 hertz. She is not the very highest, but she is much ahead of the predicted mean for her age group. Now, there's a lot more to the story of Celeste. This is a sociometric diagram showing for this block network who named who as friends in the interviews. Celeste is a sociometric star at the center of the network with symmetrical arrows showing who's the highest. The number below her name is a communication index. She's also the highest. Now, this index combines the density of contacts within the neighborhood with the proportion of contacts outside the neighborhood. Thus, Celeste fits into the model of the two-step flow of influence developed by Katz and Lazarsfeld in their studies of the diffusion of innovation in Decatur, Illinois, and many other places. In this model, information and influence do not flow evenly from the larger society to all members of the group. Rather, there are a small number of individuals, variously called influentials or opinion leaders, who receive and transmit the latest forms, fashions, ideas, and information to those in the network around them. Now, Celeste wasn't simply a conduit of information and fashion. She was a powerful force for altering the social world around her. In the narrative you heard, she dealt with the heavily controlling influence of the patriarchal Italian family. She deals with her father through Georgie, and she controls Georgie as well. You better be there. She manipulates the rules of the canteen by negotiating with the sailors who take her in. Once inside, she organizes things as well. Well, she told another story of how she said to a friend at the canteen, "You see that guy in the corner? I'm going to marry him." "Oh, you're crazy. You don't even know who he is." But she did. She did marry him. That was Jim Sullivan, the draftsman whose Irish name she bears. Through the study of Celeste's career and a half dozen others, we began to define more closely these leaders of linguistic change. They're young women from the second or third generation of newly arriving ethnic groups, upwardly mobile, defiant of social norms that they consider unwarranted and unjust, and quick to intervene when they judge things to be going wrong. Essentially, they're nonconformists. Nonconformity seems to be intimately involved with the incrementation of language change, but what type of nonconformity it is remains to be discovered. Further explorations of linguistic change in North America found radical dialect differences in many big cities, and we propose to assess the effect of these extreme differences on people's ability to understand one another. The project on cross-dialectal comprehension selected 3 cities: Philadelphia, Chicago, and Birmingham. My colleague Sharon Ash set out to locate and record the most advanced speakers she could in the local dialects of Chicago and Birmingham. She was armed with the findings of our Philadelphia study. These upwardly mobile young women from newly arrived ethnic groups might well be found in the freshman class at local colleges. In Chicago, she selected the University of Illinois Chicago Circle, where she recorded a half dozen speakers who matched the profiles of leaders of linguistic change we found in Philadelphia. She had remarkable success, as you'll see. I'm going to ask you to act for a moment as subjects in our gating experiment constructed from these recordings. Ash selected extreme instances of sound change in each city and played them as isolated words for subjects to identify, then again with the surrounding phrase, and then within the full sentence. So please ask yourself what word you'd write down when you hear
black, black, black.
And then in the phrase,
Living on one block.
and then in the sentence.
Old senior citizens living on one block.
So like most people, you first hear the word as B-L-A-C-K, and finally, some of you, but not all, come to realize that she is saying the word block the way you say black. Let's try number 6.
Bosses.
The vast majority of people write that down as B-O-S-S-E-S. But then when they hear the phrase,
The bosses with the antennas.
they wonder, what are these bosses with the antennas on them? And then,
I can remember vaguely when we had the bosses with the antennas on the top.
And so many people, but not all, realize that this speaker is saying the word bus in the way that they say boss. This remarkable rotation, the northern city shift, affects 5 of the English short vowels. After 1,000 years of stability, the English short vowels began to shift their relative places sometime in the middle of the 20th century. These changes are not isolated events. They're locked into a tight structure in which one event triggers another. Short A, as in cad, moves to kid. Short O, as in cod, moves towards cad. And long open O moves from cod down to cod. Subsequently, short E, as in ked, moves back towards cud, and the vowel of cud moves back towards cod, as you've heard. In the 3rd volume of Principles of Linguistic Change, I'm wrestling with the origins, the governing principles, and the driving forces behind the northern city shift. Here I'd like to introduce you to the speaker of this advanced forms you just heard, Jackie Garapedian, a 19-year-old resident of the Chicago suburbs.
Well, I believe that if someone dreams about death, that it means change, positive change. I had a dream that my mother was dead, and although I woke up kind of scared, I just looked at it as change, either marriage or something. I know she just got a new job. She works for AMA. So that's why, I put it towards that, is she just got a new job. So that's what my dream was about. A friend of mine had a dream that this one guy died, and he lives downstairs from me, and she actually saw him in the coffin. And his sister dreamt the same dream, and his cousin dreamt the same dream. 3 people dreamt the same dream about this guy. Now that kind of gets me a little scared now. Okay, 3 different people dreaming about the same guy in the same dream. We don't tell him about this dream, not to get him worried.
Well, at one point in the interview, Sherry discovered that Jackie does quite a bit of bar hopping. So she asks again about her age and gets this remarkable count.
19. I have a fake ID. That a police officer, by the way, gave me. I won't mention his name. Well, my girlfriend goes to Illinois State University out in Normal, Illinois, and we met a policeman out there who he confiscated these IDs from other girls, and he says, take this back to Chicago and put it to use. And it happens that this girl looks like me. She's got the brown eyes, the brown hair, the height, the weight. So all I did was memorize the social security number and her address, and it's fine. It gets me everywhere. I mean, I don't go out crazy in this bar where I walk out staggering. I know I have my limits.
So Jackie conforms to our model of a nonconformist who molds the circumstances of the world to fit her own view of what to do and how to do it. Now I have to confront the problem of the individual. I presented you with 5 of them and tried to show you what I've learned from each. Yet, in my view of language, the community is the significant unit, not the individual. I presented Donald Poole, Jacob Schissel, Larry Hawthorne, Celeste Sullivan as archetypical of the communities they represent. They do have individual style and particular traits of speaking. What we learn from them is their projection of the community norms. Now, in this respect, Jackie Garapedian might be a problem. Is she the realization of a community process or just a special individual? We had to confront this problem in constructing the Atlas of North American English. We found that the country was far too big and linguistic change too fast for its traditional methods of American dialect geography to trap the country as a whole. But Sherry Ash, Charles Boberg, and I decided to solve this problem by a telephone survey of all cities over 50,000 population. The first 2 people to answer the phone and say they were born and raised in that city would represent the speech patterns of that city. Would such a method find speakers as extreme as Jackie Garapedian? The answer, to my great surprise, was yes. The northern city shift was not a special feature of Chicago English, nor Rochester or Buffalo. And here's a photograph of all the cities involved. The cities inside the red line are involved in the northern city shift, characteristic of the speech for a vast area around the Great Lakes: Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, Toledo, Flint, Grand Rapids, Chicago, Joliet, Kenosha, Milwaukee. In many of these cities, our telephone survey found speakers with the extreme vowel rotation you've just heard. We found that the northern city shift extended over a territory of 88,000 square miles, affecting some 134 million people. Given the great mobility of the American population and the intense exposure of everyone to the mass media, you might expect only traces of regional differences. But this figure shows how uniform the actual result actually is. The brown symbols are speakers who show the basic pattern you heard in Jackie Garapedian's pronunciation, where buses is close to bosses. For them, the mean measurements of the vowel in mother and cut reflect a pronunciation further back in the mouth than the vowel in bother and cat. The yellow circles show just the opposite relations of the two word classes. Now, the uniformity of the Inland North adds another puzzle to our research agenda. The geographic domain reflects the settlement pattern of the first half of the 19th century, but the northern city shift began in the middle of the 20th. I gradually came to believe that the triggering linguistic event occurred during the great religious ferment of the Second Great Awakening and the abolitionist movement in the 1850s, with consequences we detected a century later. The problem becomes even more challenging when we realize that the northern dialect region outlined here matches closely the territory of the blue states as defined in the 2000 and 2004 presidential election. I've explored this matter in chapters 10 and 11 of the forthcoming third volume of Principles of Linguistic Change. As I noted before, the archetypical exponents of linguistic change in progress are marked by that characteristic feature of mainstream America, upward social mobility. Not only do they have better jobs than their parents, but till recently they could expect their children to have better lives than their own. In my study of the Lower East Side of New York City, this was true of all groups except African Americans, who generally showed downward social mobility. And nothing that I had done arrested that tendency. Though I learned a great deal from Larry Hawthorne, he did not learn much from me. And as the years went by, the rates of violent death, incarceration, and poverty increased for African Americans and residents of the city centers. Now, as a member of the National Academy of Sciences, I was appointed to a committee on preventing reading difficulties among young children, where I learned a fair amount about reading research. I found that none of the current methods were effective in closing the minority gap in reading achievement, which we see here. Starting with the period shortly after Larry Hawthorne, back in 1971, up to 2004, the gap is almost constant. One question was ever present in my mind was whether linguistic research could be useful where other methods had failed. In 1997, with the help of funding legislated by Senator Specter, I began research within the schools on ways to use our knowledge of African American youth to raise reading levels in low-income elementary schools. Some of that information had to do with dialect differences and how they affected reading. More important is what I'd learned from Larry Hawthorne, the Jets, and the Cobras on their experience, attitudes, and ways of thinking. In particular, their deep distrust of the school as an institution and their resentment of the unfairness of the everyday practice of a racist society. Over a period of 10 years, I developed a tutorial program for training undergraduate tutors in local schools, which was tested on a national scale for struggling readers who are white, African American, and Latino. This Reading Road program puts to work our knowledge of the alphabet, our knowledge of children's language, and our knowledge of children's interests, concerns, and problems. We used what we learned about how to get people to talk freely about things that really matter to them with such questions as, did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do? Did you ever have a dream that really scared you? So this last speaker I'd like to present to you, some of whom I learned a great deal about language and about life, is Latasha, who was interviewed in our work in the West Philadelphia School.
Well, I used to be bad. I used to be bad in first grade and kindergarten. And then when it comes to second grade and stuff, they always blame me stuff because they know I always do that. But I always be good in second grade. But I used to be bad in first and kindergarten because it wasn't really nothing to do. So I just be bad. And when it comes to second grade, they always blame stuff on me. Like yesterday, I got blamed because some girl hit somebody and they were jumping and they thought it was me and my friends. Me and my cousin and my friend, they always blame stuff on us, and that's not right. And I told my mom, and my mom don't do nothing. She just said, be good.
Latasha is archetypical, the young, intelligent student who's getting deeper and deeper into trouble with the school system. In the second grade, she's due to get an F in behavior. She's not alone. A sizable number of the children we tutor are suspended and expelled for fighting. Over the years, I've done my best to address the problem in the stories and graphic novels that are the heart of our instructional method. I'll illustrate our approach to the problem by a few pages from several different stories that deal with conflict resolution. Each of these is also written to focus on a particular problem in phonemic-graphemic relations. For example, the story dealing with Zeke is about a young man who promised his mother to stay out of trouble, but runs into a tough case in school. The colored letters highlight the words that follow the silent E rule, which is the focus of the story. First, we have the mother who warns she can't keep coming home because Jamal gets sent home for fighting. On the next page, Jamal encounters Zeke and the problems of how to follow his mom's advice in dealing with him. On the phone is about a conflict that arose from copying the wrong answer off another girl's paper in a geography class. As you see from the highlighted letters, the story focuses on the digraph CH-TH-PH. And here's the problem, which we get into, a conflict which has to be resolved. Now, the third example is from our commercial version of Portals, published by Houghton Mifflin, sold in California this year. It's actually drawn from the experience of Larry Hawthorne. His disciplinary record in high school showed a severe conflict about his refusal to take off his coat in class. Larry told us he had a hole in his pants, and he wasn't going to take off his coat or explain it to his teacher. In my version, the hero, Chad, has also promised his mother to stay out of trouble. But when he helps a little girl get her cat out of a bush, he rips a big hole in his pants. He heads to school hoping his coat will cover it. But the teacher decides to make an issue of it, and the result is what you see here. When a friend says, "Why not tell him about it?" Chad says, "How?" Most of the stories are more upbeat than this and find a solution in the problems that one way or another. The issues are open to debate and discussion and comprehension questions posed by the program. They engage the interest of the struggling readers, and one can expect good results. Figure 11 is a record of improvement in reading skills for Latasha's cadre of African-American children in Philadelphia, the same year that she was tutored. The blue line is the rate of errors in the pretest for the whole range of phonic structures that have to be decoded: the onset or consonantal beginning of the syllable, the vowel portion, and the syllable final consonants. The magenta line shows a reduction in the error rate after 24 hours of tutoring. I hope that our efforts to promote conflict resolution will have the same good success as our efforts to advance decoding skills. But we lost Latasha. Her F in behavior got her expelled. And listening more carefully to Latasha tells us something about the deeper reasons. In answer to the question, "Did you ever get into a fight with a kid bigger than you?" Latasha answered,
Well, my brother did, right? And my brother used to smoke cigarettes. And it was some little girl, she a fake Muslim. Because he said, that's why your brother did, because he was smoking cigarettes on the corner and stuff, having guns and stuff. And my brother do not have guns. All the people, they say my brother was a peacemaker. They kept on talking about my brother. And I just got to fight with him.
A little later on, Latasha gives us a further reflection on how she views the world around her.
That's why I want to be in some other, not other world, but I want to be in some other country, because around my way, it's drama around my way. I'm not just scared of them, but I just want to live. Like my brother and my cousin did, and they kept on talking about them, so I got to fight with them.
Latasha's 7 years old. She wore a necklace with pictures of her brother and her cousin who had been shot dead the year before. The graphic novels that I've written are intended to make contact with the problems of her everyday life, but they do not extend to the full measure of grim reality. You've heard one answer to the question: why do these little girls behave so badly? Latasha obeys a deep human imperative: to keep faith with the dead. Who are we to put a higher value on the school's peculiar rule, report every problem to the teacher, and never raise a hand in anger? I do not have an answer to this question, but it's omnipresent in our efforts to recreate children's confidence in an educational system that has abandoned them in isolation and despair. This work is a part of a program strongly rooted at the University of Pennsylvania to apply academic research to the solution of community problems. It reflects the philosophy that the state of our knowledge is most clearly defined by our success or failure in attempting to change the world around us. This view came with me from my early experience in the industrial world, but it's also reinforced by my participation in the Netter Center for Community Partnership at Penn. That's not to say that all academic pursuit should be driven by application. Certainly there are many fields of study that are motivated simply by our desire to know, not only in cosmology and mathematics, but in my own field to discover the mysterious forces that drive the northern city shift and are responsible for the continued renewal of linguistic change. But given the opportunity to apply our knowledge and lead a useful life, I would return to the voice of Donald Poole. When I asked him one time to define happiness, this is what he said.
What is happiness?
Oh, that's very easy, young man. That's very easy indeed. I've thought about this very deeply, and wife and I have discussed it a great deal. A lot depends in the first place how you define success. Happiness and success should go together. And what is a successful life to me may not be to you. But I believe, and I live the theory, that a man can be the most successful and also the most happy if he's doing the type of work which he enjoys. Every day's work is not work. It's not really a challenge, but it's a pleasure to do something that you enjoy doing and you feel that you know something about and that you can continue to learn something about. In other words, if I can make it clear to you, happiness consists mostly, other things being equal, of having the ability when you go to bed at night, think back at what you've done during the day, to feel that you have accomplished something useful. A man has to live with himself, and nobody knows himself like he does. What goes through your mind in the course of the day. If you go to bed at night and you feel more or less satisfied and contented that you've done the best you could, you've been fairly successful, the things have turned out fairly well for you during the day, what's wrong with that? Isn't that happiness?
In talking about my life of learning, I've not mentioned what I've learned from books, which is considerable, or my indebtedness to those who studied language change in earlier centuries, which is large. And not even what I learned from my own professor, Uriel Weinreich, which turns out to be more than I could have imagined. Instead, I've chosen to introduce you to 6 people from outside of university life. These people are more than objects of inquiry. I'm not playing the part of a doctor, introducing you to my patients, nor a lawyer, introducing you to my clients. These are people I have learned from. They're a small sample of many thousands. I've chosen them because they each possess an uncommon eloquence, each in their own way masters of the English language that allows them to share with us their experience in life and their view of the world. Over the years, their words have had a profound effect on me. I do not know when it happened. I suppose that like most linguists, I was always in love with language. But somewhere in this business of listening to people, I found that I have fallen in love with humanity. If this talk has succeeded, you will, to some small degree, have done so as well.